The fire had come down from the ridge like an avalanche of flame, devouring everything in its path. By the time the call reached Grace Whitaker, it was already too late for the trees. The wind carried smoke in thick, choking spirals, turning the late afternoon sun into a blood-orange smear across the Montana sky. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades chopping at the silence between sirens and the distant scream of wildlife fleeing the inferno. Grace stood at the edge of the containment zone, her boots sinking into ash-laced soil, one hand shielding her face from the smoke, the other gripping a two-way radio that crackled with fragmented urgency. Her breath rasped in her chest, not from fear, but from the bitter residue of memory. 15 years had passed since she'd last stepped into a fire zone, but the smell of burning pine still unearthed the same cold tremor behind her ribs. "She's trapped in the canyon," Tyler shouted over the engine noise, his voice tight with adrenaline. The young man barely looked old enough to shave, but his hands were steady on the wheel as their battered pickup barreled down the makeshift road carved by fire crews. Grace didn't answer. She didn't have to. The mare they were after had been spotted by a fire scout earlier that morning, pregnant, exhausted, isolated in a rock ravine as the wildfire curved dangerously close. No time for protocol, no time for hesitation, only instinct and the impossible weight of hope. The trail narrowed until the truck could go no farther. Grace grabbed her emergency pack, tossed Tyler a halter, and started the descent on foot, moving with the kind of grim determination that had once made her name known in every veterinary network from Missoula to Boise. She was older now, slower, but the urgency in her bones hadn't dulled. Not where life was at stake. When they reached the ravine, the air was heavy with heat and the acrid bite of ozone. The mare was there, curled awkwardly against a rock wall, her flanks heaving, eyes wide with terror. The contractions had already begun. A thin sheen of sweat darkened her chestnut coat, and flecks of foam painted her nostrils. She was trying to push, but there was no strength left in her. "We can't move her," Grace said flatly, kneeling beside the trembling body. "Not now." Tyler hesitated, glancing toward the smoke blooming in the distance. "Fire's 3 miles out, maybe less." "Then we stay," she replied, already reaching for her gloves. The next hour passed in a haze of labor, whispered reassurances, and the pounding echo of time running out. Grace guided the birth with the precision of someone who had delivered hundreds of foals, though never one under a sky that threatened to collapse in flame. When the colt finally emerged, slick and frail, he let out a strangled, wheezing cry before crumpling into the dust. Grace's hands moved with urgency, clearing his airways, rubbing his sides. "Come on," she murmured. "Breathe, little one." And he did. Shallow, stuttering breaths at first, then a steadier rhythm that made something tighten in her throat. A white star gleamed on his forehead, bright even through the soot. The mother lifted her head briefly, her eyes searching. Grace placed the colt near her side, guiding his muzzle toward her. But there was no strength left in her. She exhaled once, long, quiet, final, then went still. "No," Tyler said softly. But the truth had already settled between them. There was no time to grieve. The fire was coming, and the smoke grew thicker by the minute. Grace wrapped the colt in a wool blanket from the emergency kit and lifted him into her arms. He weighed barely anything at all. They ran, not out of panic but necessity. Tyler led the way, Grace just behind, her arms tightening every time the colt whimpered. Behind them, the sky turned the color of old rust, and the wind carried ash like falling snow. Back at Whisper Ridge Sanctuary, her modest, barely funded operation tucked into the Sierra foothills, the barn had been cleared in advance. Grace laid the colt gently onto a bed of fresh hay, her muscles trembling from effort and fear. She'd done what she could. Now it was time to see whether nature would do the rest. The odds were cruel. Without a mother's milk, most orphaned foals didn't survive. They lacked the immunity, the strength, the will. Grace had seen it before, the way they gave up, quietly in the middle of the night. She mixed a formula she hadn't used in years, the powdered milk replacer clumping slightly in the cool barn air. Tyler helped with the heating pads. They worked in silence, only the quiet grunts of the foal and the distant howl of sirens filling the space. "I'm calling him Storm," Grace said finally, more to herself than anyone. "Born of fire, may as well carry it in his name." Tyler nodded. There was nothing poetic in his expression, only the hollow fatigue of someone who had seen too much too fast. That night, Grace pulled an old camping cot into the barn and settled near the stall, the rhythmic clink of the foal's breath her only lullaby. She drifted in and out of sleep, her nerves still wired from the day's chaos. Around 2 a.m., a low sound pulled her fully awake. A soft whine, almost apologetic, from the shadows. She sat up, blinking. The barn door was slightly ajar. Ranger stood in the opening, ears perked, eyes fixed on the stall. "Not tonight," she whispered, rising to shoo him away. "He's too fragile." But before she could move, the border collie padded quietly across the straw, nosed open the gate, and stepped inside. Storm stirred weakly at the intrusion, then stretched his muzzle toward the dog with a familiarity that made no sense. Ranger responded by lying down beside him, curling his body gently around the colt's trembling frame. One paw rested protectively across Storm's back. His tongue flicked out, cleaning the foal's damp cheek in slow, deliberate strokes. Grace froze. Her every instinct screamed this wasn't safe. But the foal's breathing had slowed. His legs, which had twitched with fevered restlessness, now lay still. His head rested against Ranger's chest, and Ranger, gentle, silent, watchful, had already closed his eyes. She didn't know how long she stood there. The barn was quiet, time suspended. Something ancient, something wordless passed between the two animals. A bond not born of nature, but of something deeper. Something earned in the raw edges of survival. Grace exhaled, a sound laced with both awe and disbelief. The colt would live. She knew it then, as clearly as she knew her own name. "He's chosen to stay," she murmured, "because of that dog." And for the first time in weeks, as smoke faded to memory outside the barn, she allowed herself to hope. At first light, when the mist still clung to the earth like breath over a sleeping child, Whisper Ridge stirred with quiet purpose. In the far paddock, enclosed by weathered rails and pine-shadowed hills, two shapes moved with synchronized rhythm, one lithe and agile, the other tall and growing into his strength. Ranger barked once, short and clipped, and Storm responded with a toss of his mane, lowering his head with a playful snort. The morning ritual had begun. Grace watched from the porch with her hands wrapped around a chipped coffee mug, steam curling into the cold air. There was something about that pair, something she couldn't quite name. It had been nearly a year since the fire, but the memory of it remained scorched into her bones. What had emerged from that blaze, however, was not just survival. It was brotherhood. Storm, now almost a year old, no longer resembled the trembling foal she had carried from the canyon. His legs had grown long and powerful, his coat a gleaming silver gray that caught the sunlight like water. The white star on his forehead had stretched and sharpened as he matured, now unmistakable against the darker hues of his face. He was still a colt in age, but already showed signs of the stallion he would become: strong, alert, impossibly graceful. Yet, despite his wild lineage, there was little that was horse-like about his behavior. Not entirely. He chased sticks, dropped them at Ranger's feet, pawed the ground impatiently when his canine brother took too long to fetch. He didn't whinny at the other horses. Instead, he barked. Short, awkward imitations of Ranger's call, half whicker, half yelp. It was absurd, yet it worked. They understood each other, even when no one else could. Visitors to the sanctuary often stood in stunned silence as they watched the two animals play. Some laughed. Others cried. Children asked if Storm was a special kind of horse bred to act like a dog. Adults whispered words like miracle, impossible, or simply shook their heads. Grace never corrected them. How could she? There were no names for what they were witnessing. Inside the sanctuary, their bond had become legend. Volunteers told stories of how Ranger guarded Storm during thunderstorms, lying close to him when the younger animal trembled from distant rumbles. Storm, in turn, refused to eat unless Ranger was nearby, often waiting at the fence until the collie appeared before lowering his head to the hay. Their stall was no longer just a stall. Grace had converted the space into a shared enclosure with a dog-sized door leading in and out, allowing Ranger freedom while still keeping him tethered by love. At night, they curled into one another like they had that very first evening. Storm's head resting over Ranger's back, Ranger's nose pressed against the younger creature's flank. No one had taught them this. No one needed to. But nature, as always, demanded its due. By Storm's first birthday, the sanctuary faced a challenge Grace could no longer ignore. Horses were social creatures. They needed the guidance of a herd to learn boundaries, hierarchies, and behavior beyond the human world. If Storm were to have any future beyond the fences of Whisper Ridge, he would have to be introduced to others of his kind. Grace prepared carefully. The rehab herd, a gentle group of older Mustangs, had been chosen for their calm dispositions. Fences were reinforced. Volunteers were briefed. Ranger was kept inside the barn that day, much to his confusion. Grace approached the paddock with a halter and steady voice, trying to keep her own nerves in check. Storm balked at first, but eventually followed her into the new pasture. The other horses watched him with wary curiosity, ears pricked, nostrils flaring. For a few tense moments, silence held. Then it fell apart. Storm panicked. His hooves tore at the ground as he spun in wild circles, eyes wide with fear. He called, not with a whinny, but that strange bark-like snort he'd mimicked from Ranger. Over and over, he searched the fence line, stumbling, pressing against the gate. He didn't recognize the others as kin. He was looking for his pack. Ranger, hearing the distress from across the yard, howled, a long, anguished sound that echoed through the sanctuary. Volunteers rushed to restrain him as he clawed at the barn door, desperate to reach his brother. Storm screamed back, a sound so raw that it silenced even the watching horses. Grace stood in the middle of the paddock, her hands trembling, the halter slipping from her fingers. She had made a mistake. He didn't think he was a horse. He believed he was part of Ranger's world, and trying to force him into another was doing more harm than good. The experiment ended. Later that evening, she opened the shared stall again, and Ranger rushed to Storm's side. The young horse collapsed beside him in exhaustion, his chest heaving with spent adrenaline. Ranger curled around him without hesitation, nose buried into the colt's damp mane. From that day on, Storm no longer left the enclosure unless Ranger was with him. Grace gave up trying to integrate him into the herd. Instead, she repurposed a small pasture into a custom paddock. Half dog park, half a horse field. A sliding dog door connected it to their stall. It wasn't traditional, it wasn't what any textbook advised. But it worked. 3 years passed in a kind of quiet magic. Storm grew into a breathtaking stallion, sleek, strong, and unmistakably unique. His movements had the power of his wild lineage, yet the softness of a creature raised by gentler laws. His eyes followed Ranger with unwavering attention, and his instincts were shaped more by border collie behavior than equine dominance. Ranger, now older, had begun to show the gentle wear of time. The black fur around his muzzle faded to white, and his pace slowed on colder mornings. But his spirit never dimmed. Wherever Storm went, he followed. And wherever Ranger lay down, Storm made sure he had space to rest undisturbed. Then came the man. Jefferson Brooks arrived in a black SUV, the kind that whispered wealth before it even came to a stop. A renowned horse trainer from Tennessee, known for transforming troubled stallions into therapy animals, Brooks walked the property with the kind of easy confidence that made Grace instinctively wary. But when he saw Storm, his posture changed. The stallion was chasing a stick at Ranger's command, then bowing his head for praise as the dog barked once in approval. The visitors, donors, board members, even the local vet, watched in stunned amazement. Brooks remained silent for a long time, then finally turned to Grace. "I've never seen anything like him." His offer came later, after the tour. A figure so high it made Grace's breath hitch. Enough to expand the sanctuary, rescue more horses, secure feed through even the harshest winters. Enough to save Whisper Ridge. In exchange, he wanted Storm. "He'll have the best care," Brooks promised. State-of-the-art facilities, open fields, expert staff. He's not just a horse, he's a bridge. His temperament makes him perfect for children, veterans, anyone needing connection. And I can give him what you can't. Grace didn't respond at first. Her gaze drifted across the pasture, where Storm stood near Ranger, both of them watching from a distance, unaware of what was being discussed. They had never been apart, not even for a day. The morning Storm left Whisper Ridge. The clouds pressed low and heavy over the mountains, like the sky itself couldn't bear witness to what was happening. Grace stood at the gate, one hand on Ranger's collar, the other clenched at her side. Storm resisted the trailer at first, hooves scuffing against the ramp, nostrils wide with unease. But when Ranger gave a short, clipped bark, the one he always used to urge Storm forward during their morning games, the stallion hesitated, then stepped inside. The door shut with a hollow thud. Ranger let out a sound no one at the sanctuary had ever heard from him before. Not a bark, not a whine. Something deeper, rawer, like a thread being pulled from the soul. When the trailer began rolling down the drive, Ranger broke free, sprinting after it with a speed born of panic. He chased it down the gravel path, around the bend, all the way to the main road, his barks growing hoarse as the vehicle disappeared into the trees. Only when the dust settled did he stop, standing in the middle of the road, panting, eyes locked on the empty horizon. He didn't return to the house that night. At Jefferson Brooks' facility in Tennessee, the reception was everything promised. Wide pastures stretched beneath clean skies, lined with oaks and freshly painted fences. The staff were experienced, the accommodations pristine, and the resources unmatched. But Storm didn't care. The moment he stepped out of the trailer and into his new stall, he froze, ears twitching, eyes scanning for something that wasn't there. For 3 days, he refused food. He paced relentlessly, circling the stall, pressing his body against the gate, nickering with a bark-like urgency that confused even the most seasoned trainers. He ignored the other horses, shied from human touch, and called out in strange, broken sounds, fragments of a language no one could understand. Back in Edgewood, Ranger was no better. He refused food and water, no longer responded to his name. He lay for hours in Storm's empty stall, head resting on the straw, eyes fixed on the gate as if willing the colt to return. Volunteers tried coaxing him with favorite toys, fresh cooked meals, even rides in the truck bed he used to love. Nothing worked. Grace spent her nights between the barn and the house, carrying Ranger when his legs refused, whispering soft apologies he never acknowledged. She kept the gate open, even when logic said it was pointless. Hope had never been rational. 2 weeks passed before Jefferson called. "Grace?" His voice was tight with frustration and something close to guilt. "We've got a problem." She didn't speak, waiting. He's not adapting, won't eat, won't socialize. He's not acting like a wild horse or a domestic one either. He's grieving. Grace swallowed, her throat dry. "He's not missing his old paddock," Jefferson added. "He's missing his brother." That night, after everyone else had left, she sat in the barn, Ranger curled beside her, and wept. She had done what she thought was right, for the sanctuary, for Storm's future. But some bonds weren't meant to be severed. She called Jefferson the next morning and told him they'd be arranging for Storm's return. But the world had other plans. A freak storm system swept through the Sierra foothills, dumping days' worth of rain in a matter of hours. The dry creek that snaked through Whisper Ridge swelled into a violent torrent, snapping bridges and flooding the lower pastures. Trees cracked in the wind like gunfire. Power lines collapsed, roads washed away, and in the chaos, Ranger vanished. He had been with Grace in the barn as the winds howled and water surged through the fencing. One moment he was at her side, the next, gone. She screamed his name over the roar of the storm, ran through mud and rising water until her legs gave out, but there was no sign of him. Only silence and the sound of the creek tearing through everything they had built. She didn't sleep that night, or the night after. In Tennessee, Storm grew restless, agitated. The trainers reported strange behavior, pawing the ground, tossing his head, pacing in sharp, repetitive patterns. He began to refuse even small amounts of water. Then came the breaking point. Sometime between midnight and dawn, Storm kicked through the gate of his stall and disappeared into the hills. Surveillance footage later showed him moving with a kind of focused desperation, not panicked but determined. He didn't run aimlessly. He moved with purpose, westward, toward something no one could see but him. By the time the staff realized he was gone, Storm had cleared 2 fences and crossed a shallow river. No trail, no sound, just silence and a missing silhouette beneath the rising sun. Jefferson called Grace immediately, expecting panic or blame, but she didn't answer. The lines were down. The storm had severed their communication. 3 days later, an email landed in the sanctuary's inbox. It was from a farmer outside Bloomington, Indiana. Attached was a blurry photo captured by a trail camera the farmer had installed near a creek. In the image, a horse stood halfway through the water, silhouetted against a dusky sky. His coat shimmered wet and thin, his body lean from the journey, but the star on his forehead shone clearly. Grace stared at the image, hand trembling. "He's coming home," she whispered. Storm crossed the state line into Colorado on the 13th night. The mountains had begun to sharpen against the horizon, their snowy caps catching the moonlight like silver teeth. His coat, once sleek and proud, was now caked in mud and burrs. Cuts crisscrossed his legs from barbed wire fences and thorn brush. His hooves were chipped, his ribs visible under the strain of the journey. But none of that slowed him. What drove him forward was something older than memory and deeper than instinct. A bond forged not in a pasture or stable, but in the fragile heat of a newborn's breath, shared beside a dog who'd curled around him like a brother and kept him alive before he even understood what life was. He swam through icy rivers that carved through farmland, slipped past highways in the dead of night, waiting until the traffic was thin and the moon was high. Trail cameras captured glimpses of him in Missouri and Kansas, just a flash of movement, a shimmer of white across his brow, vanishing as quickly as it came. Word spread across rancher forums and rescue networks. A lone Mustang moving west, heading home. No tags, no human rider. Just determination etched into every muscle. But none of them tried to catch him. They stood at a distance, left buckets of water at fence posts, scattered hay in the edge of fields, and watched from porches in reverent silence. Grace had made a quiet request. Let him go where he needs to go. And so they did. Back in Edgewood, the sanctuary had finally dried out, but the land still bore scars. The main pasture fence was twisted and useless. Half the barn roof had collapsed under the weight of flood debris. The creek, once a gentle ribbon of water, had carved a new course, a deep ravine lined with broken rock and slick earth. They still hadn't found Ranger. Grace hadn't stopped looking. Every morning she hiked the banks, calling his name, scanning the underbrush, listening for movement that never came. Sometimes she dreamed she heard him, barking faintly in the distance, but always woke to silence and cold sheets. Her guilt ran deeper than any washout or broken fence. She had sent Storm away, thinking it was for the best. Now one was lost in the wilderness and the other was possibly dead. But then, on the 24th morning after Storm's escape, it happened. A volunteer from a nearby rescue center radioed in just after sunrise. A Mustang matching Storm's description had been spotted near the ridge 2 miles east of Whisper Creek. Grace dropped everything. The feed buckets, her radio, even her gloves. She didn't wait for help, she just ran. The fog still hung thick in the pines, draped like wool across the shoulders of the land. Her boots slipped on wet leaves and loose shale as she climbed. Her lungs burned from the cold air and the pace, but she didn't stop. And then she saw him. Storm stood on a rise, silhouetted by pale morning light. His chest heaved with effort, his body trembling with exhaustion, but he didn't move when she called his name. His ears flicked, but his gaze was fixed elsewhere, down the slope, toward the new course of the creek. He let out a sharp, high-pitched sound, not quite a whinny, not quite a bark, and waited. Then he did it again, louder. The sound rang through the canyon like a memory come to life. That's when Grace heard the reply. A bark, weak, strangled, but real. She staggered forward, gripping a low-hanging branch for support. The slope dropped steeply ahead, the earth loose from the recent rains. Storm stood just at the edge, his front hooves balanced an inch from where the ground crumbled. Below, nearly 20 feet down, was a narrow ledge carved by the storm's wrath. And on that ledge, barely moving, was Ranger. He was alive. Matted fur, sunken eyes, ribs poking through, but alive. He must have been swept down during the flood and had somehow managed to scramble onto the ledge, marooned there for over 2 weeks. The fall had left him injured. His hind leg bent at a strange angle, his movements sluggish and stiff. And yet, hearing Storm's voice, he had summoned enough strength to bark. Grace dropped to her knees, heart pounding. Tears blurred her vision. Storm stayed at the edge, letting out another strange call. A rhythm. A language built from shared years and silent nights. Ranger answered again, lifting his head with what little energy he had. The two of them remained like that, speaking across the gap of stone and time, two broken bodies clinging to a bond that had never once broken. Grace scrambled to her feet and radioed the rescue team. Within 20 minutes, a crew had arrived with climbing gear and ropes. But the situation was worse than they thought. The ledge was unstable. The walls above it crumbled with the lightest touch. Any attempt to scale down could collapse the entire section and take the Ranger with it. "We need a helicopter extraction," the lead technician said grimly. "But that'll take hours, maybe more." "We don't have hours," Grace snapped, staring at her friend on the ledge. "He won't make it." The team looked at each other, uncertain. Then Storm did something no one expected. He stepped forward, one hoof, then the other, placing himself directly at the lip of the ravine, testing the ground with weight and caution. His ears flicked back, then forward, as if listening for commands only he could hear. "What is he doing?" someone asked. Grace didn't blink. "He's trying to help." They watched in stunned silence as the stallion pressed his body into a brace stance, legs spread, head low, spine taut. Grace moved without thinking. She grabbed a rope, wrapped it around Storm's chest in a makeshift harness, then tied the other end to the climbing gear. "You're going to use the horse as an anchor?" a rescue worker asked, appalled. "He's stronger than anyone here," Grace said, her voice firm, "and he won't let his brother fall." The team hesitated, then obeyed. Storm didn't flinch as they hooked the rope to a harness worn by one of the techs. The moment the rope drew taut, he adjusted instinctively, stepping back, shifting his weight, counterbalancing with precision no human had taught him. As the technician descended inch by inch toward the ledge, rocks crumbled beneath his boots, but Storm held firm. When the tech reached Ranger, the dog gave a faint wag of his tail. They moved fast, lifted him into the sling, signaled the team. As they rose, the ledge gave way in a silent collapse, sending debris into the rushing water below. But it was too late to stop the rescue. Ranger was already halfway up. Storm never moved, never faltered. Only when the sling touched solid ground did he release a single, guttural sound, a cry torn from the deepest place in his chest. It wasn't a sound of triumph. It was relief, raw and absolute. Only when the vet confirmed that Ranger would survive, dehydrated, wounded, but alive, did Grace finally let go. She buried her face in Storm's neck, breathing in the scent of sweat and mud and something unspoken. Storm stayed beside his brother for the entire ride home. They had found each other again, and this time nothing would separate them. Before the harness even touched Storm's shoulders, the air around Whisper Ridge carried a weight no one dared name out loud. He didn't move from the ravine's edge, muscles coiled beneath his dappled coat, eyes fixed on the ledge below where Ranger still lay, silent, barely visible through the mist and morning light. The rescue team, more accustomed to coordinating with other humans than relying on a horse's instincts, exchanged glances that held more questions than confidence. But Grace said nothing. She had seen what they hadn't. This wasn't just about courage or strength. Storm wasn't volunteering. He was answering a call. The harness, looped through a reinforced rescue line, was connected to a pulley system anchored to the surrounding pines. At the other end, a technician in a helmet clipped into the descent rig and gave a brief nod. The ground beneath Storm shifted with each gust of wind. The soil near the edge still damp and loose from the recent storms, but the stallion held steady. When the rope snapped taut and the weight of the rescuer shifted down into the ravine, Storm responded with something beyond training. He braced. As the man began his careful descent, boots slipping on rocks that cracked and flaked under pressure, the rope jerked. The entire hillside seemed to inhale. But Storm lowered his body, widened his stance, and leaned back against the sudden force like a tree catching the wind. His eyes didn't leave the figure below, not even when the man faltered again and rocks cascaded past him into the angry water below. The moment Ranger's body came into view, barely more than fur and ribs and trembles, Storm's ears pricked forward. His breath hitched, and from deep in his throat came a sound that hadn't been heard before, a rasping, guttural noise that lived somewhere between a whinny and a bark. The team paused. The rescuer whispered something they couldn't hear, but the way his hand moved over Ranger's small frame told them everything they needed to know. Ranger had survived, just barely. The rescue sling wrapped around his fragile frame like a cradle made of hope. As it began to rise, Storm backed slowly with it, adjusting his weight to maintain balance with every inch gained. Grace watched from beside the rigging, hands clenched, eyes never leaving either of them. This wasn't a maneuver. It was an act of trust forged over years and sealed in silence. When the sling crested the ridge and Ranger's paws touched the earth again, Storm stepped forward. The team moved instinctively to block him, but Grace raised her hand. The stallion lowered his head, not with force or urgency, but reverence. His muzzle touched the side of Ranger's face, and the dog stirred faintly, letting out a sound that barely qualified as a whimper. Storm didn't retreat. He stayed close, pacing step for step beside the stretcher as the vet examined Ranger's battered frame and confirmed what they all hoped: he would make it. 3 months later, the sanctuary bore little trace of the flood that had nearly broken it. Green returned to the hills, laughter returned to the barns, and new structures rose where only outlines had stood before. But no addition drew more awe than the one nestled between the creek and the trees, a shared habitat, unlike anything in the region, built specifically for two creatures whose story had reshaped the meaning of family. They called it the Forever Field. It spanned 10 acres, divided not by fences but by intention. One half belonged to Storm, designed for open gallops and soft earth. The other, outfitted with climbing mounds, shaded tunnels, and gentle trails, was for Ranger. In the center, a shelter built low to the ground offered warmth in winter and cool in summer, with space for one dog-sized bed and a straw-padded stall wide enough for a Mustang to rest without fear. No locks, no barriers. Just a home that had always belonged to both of them. Their story had traveled farther than Grace ever expected. News outlets had aired their reunion. Donations had poured in from all 50 states. Letters arrived by the dozens, some written in crayon, others typed by strangers who'd lost siblings or pets or hope. Each one carried the same message. This story changed something in me. Researchers from 3 universities arrived, not with cages or charts, but open minds. They studied the way Storm responded to canine gestures. They recorded the synchronized patterns in their movement, the mutual alertness when danger approached, the unspoken coordination that came only from years of being something the world never thought they could be. Brothers. Jefferson Brooks returned, not with lawyers or papers, but with a check and a nod. He transferred Storm's ownership back to Grace and added a generous endowment to ensure the sanctuary would never again face the kind of choice that had nearly torn them apart. "Some things," he said quietly as he watched the 2 animals trot through the field, "aren't meant to be separated, no matter how carefully we plan." At dusk, visitors stood behind the observation fence and watched as Storm ran circles around Ranger, who barked in reply with a playfulness that belied the scars he still carried. Occasionally, they'd stop beside each other, one paw against one hoof, just breathing the same air. That evening, as the sun sank below the ridge and the fields went still, Grace walked the path alone with a lantern in hand. The dogs were already inside. The horses, quiet. But she knew where they'd be. Inside the shared shelter nestled in the straw, Storm lay with his long neck curved gently around Ranger's resting body. The same posture they had taken years ago in the hayloft barn. No one had shown them how. No one had asked them to. It was just who they were. And somehow, in a world full of noise, they had found a way to make everyone finally understand.